Chapter 17 of Mapping the Human Mind. Crossing Boundaries, the Age of Exploration and the Clash of Civilizations. By the late 15th century, maps were no longer static. Once marked by blank spaces and here be dragons, their edges began to fill. Driven by trade, curiosity, ambition, and hunger for new routes and riches, European explorers set sail and changed the world. But what they encountered wasn't just new terrain. They stumbled into civilizations with rich traditions, cosmologies, and symbolic systems of their own. For centuries, ideas had crossed continents through trade routes, translations, and whispers in distant courts. Now, for the first time in recorded history, the people who lived those worldviews, who practiced the rituals, carried the stories, embodied the myths, stood face to face. What had once been mediated through interpretation or mythic distance became immediate, witnessed, and undeniable. Such collisions weren't just about land or conquest. They struck at the deepest layers of meaning, how societies understood life, death, and the cosmos itself. When old frameworks cracked under the weight of new realities, belief systems became more crucial than ever. When worldviews shatter. The midday sun cast shadows over a stepped Mayan temple. The year is 1519. A Spanish conquistador, fresh off a ship that brought both steel and scripture, stares down at a ceremony utterly alien to his understanding. The jungle hums behind him, thick with heat and birdsong. The air is dense with incense. Rhythmic chanting rises like a spell from the crowd below. A priest, painted in sacred symbols, raises a blade. The ritual he witnessed would not have made sense through his own frame of reference, only through the lens of his own beliefs. The blood offerings, sacred chants, and ceremonial precision were filtered through a mind steeped in Catholic teachings and Renaissance ideals. What he saw struck him not only as foreign, but as something deeply unsettling, something that clashed with his worldview so completely it felt irreconcilable. When Hernan Cortes encountered Aztec sacrifice, his beliefs read it as demonic. When Aztec priests observed communion, the ritual eating and drinking of Christ's body and blood, they may have seen echoes of their own sacred rites, but to both sides the other interpretation was unthinkable. Centuries later, cognitive science gives us language for what happened in that moment. Psychologists call these mental frameworks schemas, the invisible structures that shape what we see, how we judge, and what we believe possible. These were deep psychological ruptures. When two incompatible realities confront each other, it creates more than confusion, it creates crisis. What we now call cognitive dissonance is the mental strain that emerges when belief is challenged by evidence that doesn't fit. The more central the belief, the more painful the rupture. For the Aztecs, whose gods fell silent in the face of conquest, or the Inca, whose emperor, the living son of the sun, was taken by strangers, the dissonance wasn't theoretical, it was existential. Even for the conquerors, the psychological toll was real. Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon described feeling physically ill after witnessing an Inca child sacrifice. Modern neuroscience helps explain why. Core beliefs are processed in the same regions of the brain that handle threat and emotional pain. When those beliefs collapse, the body reacts like it's under attack. In moments of profound rupture, belief adapts not just to explain reality, but to help survivors endure it. Modern psychology shows that when faced with overwhelming trauma, belief systems can serve as vital scaffolding, reshaping fractured worlds into something still livable, even when certainty has crumbled. 16th century Nahua accounts describe the psychological aftermath of conquest in terms we might now recognise as collective trauma. Our inheritance, our city, is lost and dead. The shields of our warriors could not save it. This wasn't mere military defeat but existential collapse. When gods fail, the entire framework of meaning fails with them. For Europeans, though they had military advantage, these encounters also created cognitive dissonance that would eventually transform Western thought. Reports of complex civilizations with advanced mathematics, astronomy, and architecture challenged European assumptions about human development. How could primitive peoples without Christian revelation create sophisticated calendars more accurate than Europe's? And beneath these seemingly surface-level disagreements lay fundamentally incompatible assumptions about time, divinity, and humanity's place in the cosmos. Linear versus cyclical time. By the age of exploration, many Europeans saw history as a straight line, a story that ran from creation to Judgment Day. This way of thinking was shaped by Christian teachings and later reinforced by new ideas of progress under the Enlightenment and the rise of industry. But it hadn't always been this way. Earlier European traditions had followed the rhythms of the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, and turning of the stars, a world where time moved in circles, not lines. Across the oceans, many indigenous cultures kept this view alive. In American and Asian traditions, time was often seen as cyclical, with ages repeating, events echoing, and cosmic patterns returning again and again. This wasn't a case of simply having different calendars, they were different ways of experiencing reality itself. Material versus animated universe. By the time of European expansion, Western thought was drifting towards a material view of nature, one shaped by scholastic theology, Renaissance rationalism, and early scientific efforts to categorize, measure, and control the world. Matter was becoming inert. Nature was something to be observed, dissected, and ultimately dominated. But this perspective wasn't universal. Even within Europe, it had only recently overtaken older, more relational ways of seeing. Pre-Christian traditions had long regarded forests, rivers, and mountains as alive with spirit. The rise of monotheism and later scientific materialism gradually replaced these views with the image of a mechanistic universe governed by impersonal laws. In contrast, many indigenous worldviews still held to a profoundly animated cosmos, where consciousness, spirit, and agency were not limited to humans, but embedded throughout nature itself. When a Lakota elder spoke of consulting the spirits of animals, European listeners often heard only superstition. But what they were hearing was, in fact, a sophisticated way of knowing, one that saw the natural world not as a passive backdrop, but as an active participant in human and cosmic life. And these weren't just poetic metaphors, they were distinct ways of knowing, rooted in relationship rather than extraction, reciprocity rather than control. This divergence wasn't limited to how people related to the natural world, it extended to how they understood knowledge itself. European systems increasingly emphasized written scripture and authoritative texts as the ultimate source of truth. Rooted in Greek traditions of classification and abstract logic, truth was something to be recorded, argued, and preserved in fixed form. But many indigenous traditions prioritized direct experience, oral transmission, and ceremonial memory. Knowledge lived in seasonal cycles, in the spoken word, in relationships between generations and the land, not in fixed pages. In many ways, these experiential systems echoed Europe's own older traditions, before writing became dominant, before logic eclipsed myth, before the sacred was confined to scripture. This wasn't a matter of technological delay, but of epistemological divergence. Anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss would later argue that these different approaches weren't signs of primitive versus advanced minds, but distinct, coherent ways of ordering reality, each adapted to the structure and scale of its society. Indigenous classifications of plants, animals, and natural phenomena often rivaled scientific taxonomy in complexity, but they didn't seek universality. They sought meaning, embedded, local, and specific. These living knowledge systems, carried in memory, ceremony, and song, were about to face a crisis no tradition could withstand. Biological exchange and spiritual crisis. The conquest of the Americas wasn't accomplished by swords and guns alone. The most devastating weapons were invisible. When European ships arrived, they carried smallpox, measles, typhus, and other diseases that indigenous populations had never encountered. The result was a demographic collapse unparalleled in recorded history. In some regions, up to 90% of native populations perished within decades. Europe itself had felt something of this devastation during the Black Death, when entire towns emptied almost overnight, when the air grew heavy with loss and the world itself seemed to fray at the edges. But in the Americas, the scale and suddenness of death unfolded without any memory of a prior collapse, without any communal framework to make sense of it. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a shattering of reality. For Europeans, the relative immunity they enjoyed seemed to confirm divine favour. God, they believed, was clearing the land for Christian settlement. For indigenous peoples, the selective devastation of their communities, while the newcomers remained largely untouched, created a profound spiritual crisis. How could traditional healing practices, sacred protections, and the favour of the gods fail so completely? Contemporary Nahua accounts speak of unbearable suffering. Communities struck down so quickly that people collapsed while they slept, unable to rise. Homes once filled with ritual and memory fell silent except for the sounds of mourning. It seemed to many as if even the gods themselves had turned away. The psychological rupture of watching your entire world unravel while strangers flourished was beyond what language could hold. The weight of that loss didn't vanish with the dead. It still reverberates across generations, in stories half remembered, in ceremonies silenced, in the ache of ancestral memory that no history book can fully capture. When traditional medicines and sacred rituals failed against invisible forces, it tore holes in the fabric of belief itself, leaving a theological vacuum that Christian missionaries were quick to fill. The resilience of belief. Belief doesn't disappear under pressure, it adapts. As colonial powers imposed new religious systems, many indigenous cultures absorbed elements of Christianity while preserving older traditions beneath the surface. In Haiti, voodoo emerged from the blending of West African spiritual practices with Catholic saints. In the Andes, statues of the Virgin Mary were quietly interpreted as manifestations of Pachamama, the Earth Mother. In Mesoamerica, old gods were recast in new roles, often hidden behind Christian imagery. This wasn't capitulation, it was survival. It was creative resistance, and it speaks to a core truth across human history. Belief systems are fluid, resilient, and endlessly reconfigurable, shaped by trauma, transformation, and transition. It was spiritual adaptation disguised as compliance, a kind of cultural alchemy that allowed ancestral meanings to flow beneath foreign forms. By weaving their traditional deities into the faces of Catholic saints, communities preserved emotional resonance and sacred continuity, protecting what could no longer be practiced openly by encoding it in new symbols. Only much later would neuroscience begin to explain what these communities already understood intuitively. that memory and meaning are deeply entwined. The brain builds pathways that connect symbols to emotion, ritual to identity, and by reshaping the surface while preserving the structure beneath, syncretism allowed cultural memory to survive even under occupation and erasure. In the Andes, when indigenous communities participated in Catholic processions honouring saints, they simultaneously maintained ritual connections to mountain deities and earth spirits. The external form changed, but the underlying neural architecture of belief, the emotional connections, cultural memories, and spiritual significance remained intact, though transformed. Yet even as these systems adapted and endured, colonial powers increasingly dismissed, suppressed, or erased them. Colonization of the mind. One of the most enduring legacies of this period is the creation of a hierarchy of beliefs. European colonial powers didn't just bring religion. They brought the idea that their way of understanding the world was the only valid one. The West became civilized, while everyone else was labelled primitive or savage. This hierarchy was not only applied to religion, but to knowledge systems broadly. Indigenous astronomical knowledge that had accurately tracked celestial movements for millennia was dismissed as superstition. Complex agricultural systems adapted to local environments over generations were replaced with European methods, often ill-suited to tropical conditions. Traditional pharmacopoeias containing effective medicinal plants were labelled as witchcraft, even as European doctors quietly adopted their remedies. The colonial categorization of knowledge created what philosopher Miranda Fricker calls epistemic injustice. The devaluation of certain groups' knowledge based not on its accuracy or utility, but on who produced it. This was a systematic dismantling of knowledge systems that had allowed diverse cultures to thrive in their environments for thousands of years. The psychological impact of this epistemic violence continues today. When traditional knowledge is devalued or appropriated without acknowledgement, it perpetuates what the Maori scholar Linda Tuai Smith calls colonization of the mind. The internalization of the idea that indigenous knowledge is inherently inferior to Western science. Even as belief systems adapted beneath the surface, colonial powers worked to enforce rigid hierarchies, not just over people, but over ways of knowing themselves. The hierarchies of knowledge. Yet, despite this dismantling, many of these ways of knowing did not vanish. Suppressed, yes, but not silenced. Beyond religion, the age of exploration revealed a world filled with different ways of understanding nature, time, and humanity. These knowledge systems persisted, adapted, and in many cases profoundly influenced global science and thought. Polynesian navigators using stars, ocean swells, and bird migrations crossed vast stretches of ocean without instruments, feats that stunned European sailors, who initially dismissed them as myth. Mesoamerican mathematicians developed the concept of zero and place value notation independently of the Old World, creating calendars more accurate than those in Europe. In the Amazon, traditional ecological knowledge catalogued thousands of medicinal plants, wisdom that modern pharmaceutical companies still draw upon today. Healing practices evolved too, blending European techniques into indigenous frameworks while preserving deep-rooted principles of balance, energy, and spiritual causation. These syncretic systems continue to provide care in regions underserved by modern healthcare, preserving links to pre-colonial memory and meaning. Over time, these knowledge systems reshaped global science itself. When Alexander von Humboldt travelled through Latin America in the early 1800s, his revolutionary ecological insights were profoundly shaped by indigenous worldviews, ones that already saw nature as an interconnected web of life. The scientific revolution that transformed Europe in the 17th century didn't happen in isolation. Encounters with new plants, animals, landscapes, and people pushed reality beyond ancient texts. Observation began to take precedence over authority, a shift that became the foundation of modern science. But the exchange of knowledge was only part of the story. As the old maps of the world expanded, so too did the inner maps of human possibility. A new kind of consciousness, stitched together from many worlds, was quietly beginning to form. The globalization of consciousness. A Portuguese caravel cuts through the Atlantic swell in the early 15th century, light, fast, experimental. Its triangular sails strain against the wind, designed for agility more than brute force. Below deck, the crew trades rumours of gold, strange spices, and places that don't appear on any map. They don't know they're laying the foundation for empire. They're not thinking about conquest or cosmology, only wind, salt, and time. But with each journey down the African coast, with each tentative anchoring in unfamiliar ports, something begins to shift. The edges of the known world start to blur. Familiar categories, Christian and heathen, civilized and savage, centre and periphery, are no longer fixed. The sea connects more than it divides, and suddenly the old maps seem too small to hold what the world is becoming. What began as exploration soon deepened into entanglement. Beliefs, practices, and worldviews were pulled from their geological roots and scattered across the globe. The spiritual marketplace we know today, where Buddhism meets biohacking and indigenous rituals echo through wellness retreats, emerged from these early collisions, when symbolic systems began to circulate freely, often severed from their original contexts. The frameworks we use to navigate reality now, whether scientific or spiritual, individualist or collective, are still shaped by those collisions. Our modern consciousness, with its ability to hold competing truths, to translate between worlds, to resemble meaning from fragments, was born in the shockwaves of contact. And that story isn't over. New paradigms continue to emerge, digital realities rewire our perception, scientific revolutions reshape our definitions of truth. Religious traditions evolve, hybridize, and resist. But in studying how humans once navigated the most profound worldview collisions in our history, we uncover something timeless: our capacity for adaptation, synthesis, and resilience. In the ruins of conquest and the echoes of forgotten gods, something new stirred, a global mind still in formation. And as old certainties gave way, the world opened, not just to trade and conquest, but to new ways of being, knowing, and believing. Next week, Chapter 18, The Industrial Revolution, when time became a machine and the soul got lonely. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Narrative.